And I'm going to give the update on soybean insect pest, and I'm mainly going to be talking about insecticides and alternatives to chlorpyrifos, because as you know, we lost that. And then my colleague Pat Beauzay, IPM coordinator, is going to talk about the wheat insect pest update. So first, I got a little bit of good news. It looks like the drought is subsiding, at least in the eastern part of North Dakota, and then up in northwest and the northern part of Minnesota, it's improving, and they'll likely remove it. So that's the good news for today. And then, of course, the bad news is that we are getting all tolerances of chlorpyrifos revoked, and it will expire in February 28th this year. So please do not use Lorsman and generics on any of your crops this year or in the future. Unfortunately, it's gone, and I'll be talking about today alternatives that you have. So we had a major drought this last year, a severe drought, and grasshoppers are one of the pests that occur when we have a drought. They do very well in the hot, dry weather. They have chewing mouth parts, so they can strip the foliage off the plant. They can chew on the pods and also clip the pods, and they'll fall right off. And they're most concentrated on the field edges when they first occur in the field, and we can often, like spray the edge of the field if we catch it early enough. And one of the interesting things about grasshopper is they need to warm up before they start chewing on your crop. So that's why you see them basking in the sun in the morning. They need to get an internal body temperature of 68 to 100 degrees before they start chewing. So here's the IPM crop survey maps for the last 2 years. And anything in a yellow square or a red triangle indicates fairly high populations. So you can see we had quite a few grasshopper problems this last year due to the number of density of the grasshoppers. We do have one new chemical that is available, Vantacor. It's a diamine of group 28, and it's in the new insect management guide. And it's available for foliar sprays for all your Lepidoptera pests, which would include cutworms, your foliage feeding caterpillars, Thistle Caterpillar, green clover worm, and grasshoppers. FMC produces it. They recommend that you use an MSO at 1% volume and target the earlier young grasshoppers that are not fully mature yet. So we tested it this last year at Castleton. We did a low 0.7, medium 1.2, and then a high 1.7 rate. And then we used our standards, Cobalt Advanced and Warrior 2. And as you can see, this is grasshopper counts per square yard. You can see it worked very well compared to our 2 standards, and the untreated check with significantly higher number of grasshoppers. So it's going to be a good alternative insecticide for you to go to. We really need to, try to not use as many pyrethroids. We're seeing a real surge in pyrethroid resistance in the insect world. So these alternative modes of action, I would highly recommend that you use. And of course, Cobalt Advanced is a premix with chlorpyrifos, so it's gone. So here's all the different insecticides in soybean that we have for grasshopper control. At the top is Dimlin, difluorobenzuron. It's an insect growth regulator. And so it prevents the insect from molting when they're growing as a young nymph. So it's fairly inexpensive, just $4, but it's only available for use west of Highway 281 in North Dakota. And that's probably, I don't know why they have that, but that's where most of the grasshoppers are, in the western part. Then we have a couple organophosphates, and also all this pink is the pyrethroids. And they can range in cost from $2 to $8 or more, depending on the rate in the product. And then you may never have heard about Steward EC, that's a 22A. And it's very effective on grasshoppers and all your lepidopteran pests as well. And then the new one, Manticore at the bottom here. The interesting thing about this one is it may be useful to you late in the season when the grasshoppers move in. It has a 1-day pre-harvest interval. So, and it's also a little, it's like the cost of a high rate of a pyrethroid, about $10 at the low rate. And the low rate was very effective, as you saw. So then another insect that's a problem during drought is two-spotted spider mite. Very tiny. They attack over 500 different plants, including all of our field crops, ornamentals, and trees. They overwinter as egg and vegetation, often in alfalfa. And they have a very short life cycle. They reproduce really fast when it's hot, only 5 days. And it's cooler, it could take up to 19 days. They're very tiny. If you have a pen and you put a little dot on your piece of paper, that's about the size of a mite. So, and we did see an increase from the IPM crop survey data in spider mites from 2020 to 2021. So they did go up, which isn't surprising. They are mainly on the field edges. They move in from the ditches in the alfalfa fields when they're cut, and the ditches are cut or mowed, and then they like to move into the field crops. So you probably won't see spider mites unless you're out there scouting and turning the leaves over and using a white sheet of paper and wrapping the foliage over it. But you might see the symptoms, little white specks, or stippling we call it. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts, so they feed in the individual plant cells. They extract that green tissue, so you end up with a white spot. And then they start at the bottom of the plant and work their way up as they're feeding. So look at those bottom leaves first. And then they start to turn yellow once they get more mites on them, more feeding, and then they go bronze, and then they get brown and shrivel up and die and drop off. But you don't want to see that. Don't wait that long to control them. And then they web, that's how they disperse into the fields. They spin strands of silk just like a spider mites, and then they go up to the top of the plant and the wind carries them on the strands of silk. I got a YouTube video you can watch because I'm not talking about scouting or thresholds today. So here's what we have. Lorsbin was our go-to for spider mites, and it's gone. So what are we going to do? We do still have one pyrethroid, bifenthrin active ingredient, Brigade and generics. It's the only one that controls spider mites. Don't try to spray Asana, Mustang Max. It flares the spider mites. All the other pyrethroids do not control spider mites. It's like a growth regulator. You'll end up with more mites. I don't recommend their premixes, Hero and Sky Raider, but they're premixes with 2 active ingredients, and I don't generally recommend them because they have a lower amount of toxicity or active ingredient per ingredient when they mix them together. And I'm worried about insecticide resistance with this arthropod. And then we also have dimethoate, which is organophosphate. And then in the red box is 2 miticides that are available. Well, we've never used miticides here. I mean, they use them down in Texas, but we need to start thinking bigger and maybe use a miticide agromet. It's not very expensive, just $5. And the advantage with a miticide is it kills the eggs. The insecticides do not. So if you're using Brigade, you're gonna have to go back to Scout. It's not going to kill those eggs, and they'll hatch, and then you'll have mites again. And the other one is Seal. It's a little more spendy, but it's an excellent miticide. It will kill those mites. So with mites, because they're in the bottom, underside of the leaves, we need good water volume. So make sure you use adequate water volume to get that insecticide droplet down there. Use an adjuvant and the high rate. Always use the high rate of the insecticide at least. The miticides you can get by with a lower rate, but the high rates of bifenthrin to get that insecticide down there. Use an adjuvant when it's dry. Then go back with all the insecticides like dimethoate and bifenthrin and re-scout 5 to 7 days, because those eggs are still alive and they're going to be hatching. And you'll have more mites again. So you may need to go back and respray, so be sure you alternate your modes of action. So if you started with a pyrethroid, go to a miticide or organophosphate. And don't forget our old enemy, the soybean aphid. It's still around. And there's a scouting video if you'd like to watch. And it did increase just a little bit this last year. It wasn't economic, but you can see those, any color indicates more aphids, and you can see from 2020 to 2021 there was a slight increase, but more of an increase in Minnesota. Don't forget we have pyrethroid resistance that is widespread in North Dakota and Minnesota in the Red River Valley area, and also down in Iowa and South Dakota they have problems. So this means that we should not in this area be using pyrethroids at all, because we've tested bifenthrin and lambda-cellhydrine, which is Warrior and generics, and they are resistant or have cross resistance within that family to multiple active ingredients. So here's what we have now. I'm not including any premixes. At the top there's a carbamate and then organophosphate, and then everything in pink is pyrethroids, but I just said you really shouldn't use those. We have cross resistance in this family, pyrethroid. So they're probably not going to get good control. And then we have the 4 A's, the neonicotinoids. Well, what do we have on the label with the neonicotinoids? We have a nice little cute bee in a red box. So that bee in the red box means it's highly toxic to bees. And we've done some bee studies. For 3 years we did research on bees flying through flowering sunflower fields, and we found over 115 species. It's just incredible. So we don't want to use those. We don't want to kill our bees. So we do have 3 new ingredients here, or active, or modes of action, I should say. Savantoprime, Safina, and Transform. So this is what we should be using this upcoming year. And they're not that expensive. Transform and Safina are not that expensive. They're only about $6. Savanto Prime from Bayer Crop Science is a little more spendy, as you can see, but Bayer is working on reducing the rates lower to get the cost down for you. So here's some data on efficacy data. This is aphids per plant in the bars, and then the red line is yield in bushel per acre. And you can see Warrior was our standard, and then Transform at the low and high rate. And you can see it did an excellent job. This is before the pre-count of aphids before we sprayed. You can see it did an excellent job, and even better than Warrior. And the yields went up. We saw an increase in the yields, so we're happy there, 5 to 10 bushels. And the good thing about Transform is it's safe for the beneficial insects, our lady beetles. We counted the number of lady beetles. Here in the Untreated Check, you would expect the highest because we didn't kill the aphids, which is their food source. But here in the Warrior, there's hardly any lady beetles. But in the Transform, there's significantly more lady beetles present. So that's good. It's safer insecticide. Some of these newer chemistries are very specific to piercing, sucking insects like aphids. Here's some data on Safina. And you can see again, it was excellent control. This is a premix now called Renestra, and it's also new on the market this year, and it's in the insect guide. And again, we got that 10 bushel increase, with these new insecticides. So they work very well, and they give you good yield. And this is some data from Bruce Potter, University of Minnesota, because we didn't have any Savanto Prime data. And Savanto, just look at the box here. This is Savanto Prime at only 5 fluid ounces per acre. So it's a little bit lower than what the label says. So it looks like it works at a reduced rate. And here we have Safina and then Transform, all very low. This is cumulative aphid days here, these red dots. And this would be the economic threshold here. In Warrior, it's hard for me to see at this angle, but this is Warrior, it's way up here. So these products are better than the pyrethroids. And some of them give you a fairly long residual, up to 21 days. And again, we got the 10 bushel increase. So keep your eyes open for this new insect we're starting to see, bean leaf beetle. It has a red and a green form, and it has the triangle you can use in the middle, between the wings and behind the head. And sometimes they'll have the spots, 4 spots and lines. It's mainly the adult that we're concerned with. The larvae feeds a little bit on the roots, but it's not economic. We have multiple generations, depending how warm it is, 2, maybe 3 in North Dakota, Minnesota. And you can see this is this year's data that it is increasing, especially in the southeast area where we grow a lot of our soybeans. Again, it wasn't economically important this last year, but we are seeing an increase, so I want you to watch for it. And there's, they do chewing, and just like the grasshoppers. And they have little tiny, perfectly round holes in the leaves. So it's very different than grasshopper feeding, which is kind of ragged. The leaves are ragged, and they'll chew from the edge in. You can scout for these using a sweep net, or you can look at the defoliation for doing thresholds. With the sweep net, it's 3 to 7 beetles per sweep. And they are secretive when you're going through the field. They like to go down to the ground and hide. They see you coming. And the first generation, they overwinter here, but that first generation is generally controlled by insecticide seed treatment. But we don't really have those populations to warrant that right now. And don't forget about our foliage-feeding caterpillars, our spiny little thistle caterpillar, and then the green clover worm. We had real big problems with them on dry beans and soybeans in 2019. They migrate up. So we gotta, watch for them. Use those defoliation. Then think of the big picture. Are you gonna spray a pyrethroid if you got resistant aphids? No. And don't forget about the pyrethroids flare the spider mite population and disrupt natural enemies. So, and with that, we'll hold the questions to the end. And Pat's going to cover some green.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan. I'm going to finish up here with a couple of wheat insects here, wireworms and grain aphids. So we'll start out with wireworms, and I'm going to do what Jan did. I'm going to point over at the left-hand screen here. Wireworms are a resurging pest issue, particularly in small grains and other crops that do not have good chemistries to control wireworms, which is most of our crop. And this is especially becoming a problem in western North Dakota, eastern Montana, the adjacent prairie provinces, and those wireworm populations are very severe. Wireworms are the larvae of click beetles. They're soil-dwelling insects. They, depending on the species, will have life cycle anywhere from 3 to 5 years as larvae. They prefer grasses, but they will get onto other crops as well. They're primarily root feeders, but they will get up into and tunnel into the seedlings. The species that is most dominant in our study was this one, the prairie grain wireworm, Salatosomus erypenus destructor. I just like the name of that, destructor. And this one is destructive. I used to think that all wireworms were just wireworms, but I think knowing what species you have is important. What little we know about this species is that it will feed underneath from the roots up, but it will also come across and feed from the stems down, and that is really important. Take a look at the two plots here. There's a few things going on. You can see the one that's gotten hit by the wireworms. There's obviously a stand reduction in there compared to the plot on the right, which is healthy. There's also a reduction of vigor. So loss is occurring not only by the death of the seedling, but if that seedling survives, it's not going to be as vigorous, and it's going to be delayed. And I don't think you can see very clearly here, but there's some weeds coming up in there. And where you see in a field that's been affected by wireworms, you'll see these big bare patches in the field. And those bare patches, there's no competition now for those weeds. And weeds can become a real problem in these wireworm fields. In small grains right now, what we have are, well, not anymore, but what we had were just the neonicotinoid insecticides as seed treatments. And what we know is that the neonicotinoids do not cause sufficient mortality to the wireworms to reduce their population from year to year. With the loss of lindane many years ago, that was the last organochlorine insecticide that we had, the wireworm populations have continued to slowly build and build and build and build. So to address that problem, BASF has come out with a new insecticide seed treatment called Taraxa, and we've been working with BASF over a few years in testing Taraxa in small grains. So I'm going to go through one of our studies that we did here. We have in 2018, we have this check, and that is just bare seed. There's nothing on that seed at all. We have a fungicide only, Cruiser Max Vibrance, Taraxa, that's our new insecticide with the fungicide package. The product is called Taraxa F4, and I'll talk a little bit about those in more detail in a bit. And then we tried adding the insecticide alone, Taraxa, to the Cruiser Max Vibrance package. And these are the results that we got from 2018. It was a very good year up by Mohall. That's where we've been doing all of our wireworm work. And if you look at this, you're going to say, hey, wait a minute, I can see that bear seed check getting hammered. And with the reduction in yield, reduction in stand, but there's really no difference between the insecticides and the fungicide only. And we had that very same question, how do we know that this works? So what we did is we went back to this very same trial footprint in 2019, plot for plot, treatment for treatment, and we planted a fungicide-only wheat across that entire trial footprint. And this is where things got interesting. So our 2019, now keep in mind these treatments are what was planted there in 2018. Where we had the bear check, we had a substantial reduction in stand and yield, and we found an average of 3 wireworms per plot. And the only reason that that looks as good as it does is because one of the plots actually really looked good. And I don't like to throw out data if I don't have a really good reason to do so. Where we had the fungicide only, we found 2 wireworms per plot, a significant reduction in stand and in yield. In the Cruiser Max Vibrance plot, we didn't find any wireworms, but we did see a substantial reduction in stand and yield. The clear winner was the Taraxa F4. That's where we had the least reduction in stand. We didn't find any wireworms in that plot, and we had the best yield overall. And what I think is really interesting here is where we added the Taraxa to the Cruiser Max Vibrance, we still found an average of 1 wireworm per plot. We had a substantial stand reduction and a substantial yield reduction. And it begs the question, should I add Taraxa to an existing neonicotinoid seed treatment? And our data suggests no, don't do that. We know that the neonicotinoids will not kill the wireworms. If the wireworm encounters the neonic, it's going to just become more abundant and stop feeding for a while. And that really defeats the purpose of the Taraxa, because that wireworm then might not get exposed to the Taraxa, which is going to kill it. Another reason is cost. If you did that, you would basically double your cost. All of these products are running right around $8 a hundredweight, and you don't want to double your money and not achieve your goal of killing the wireworms. Just a quick bit about Taraxa. It is only labeled for use in small grains. I have something on the bottom there, check state availability. I've done that, and it is registered for use here in Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana. So it's a new product. If you have a wireworm problem and planting small grains, I suggest that you use this product. And another hope here too is that when rotating to other crops that don't have good wireworm chemistry, using this in your small grain crop is going to knock that wireworm population down so that you don't see problems in other crops like sunflower, for instance. Okay, I'll finish up here with grain aphids. We've got this photo here, and this is what we've seen in the past couple of years. There's lots of healthy English grain aphids later in the crop stage, and even up to like soft dough. And these aphids, the question is at this point, are they causing yield loss? And I think last year answered that question under drought stress. Yes, they are causing some yield loss. They're phloem feeders. They suck photosynthate out of the plant. They excrete honeydew, and if your population gets high enough, you'll see this sooty mold growing, which will further reduce yield by just blocking sunlight. So we don't ever want to see our populations getting that high. Control is achieved, natural control. We have our lady beetles up here, adult and a larva, parasitic wasps. So you'll see these little aphid shells out in the field. That's an aphid mummy who's been attacked by a parasitic wasp. We also have fungal pathogens that, under the right conditions, can cause an epizootic that will sufficiently take down an aphid population. With the loss of fluorspan, we have these chemicals remaining. Our pyrethroids, malathion, which is effective but has a very, very short residual. Jen mentioned Suvanto and sulfoxaflor. Those are both registered in wheat as well. So I'll finish up. This is my last slide. What should we do with, especially in these later crop stages? And when Jan and I put together the insecticide management guide for this year, we addressed this. We went through the literature. There isn't a lot out there, but we found a very good paper from Sweden, actually, that the authors had measured English grain aphids, the effect on grain yield on hard red spring wheat. So we have wheat, we have our English grain aphid. They tracked that from the 1970s to the early 1990s, and they had some equations, and those equations were based on these different heading stages. So we plugged our control costs and modern wheat values into that, and I think what we see here is pretty realistic. So the thresholds are based now on these crop stages, and you can see as you get closer towards the early dough, the number of aphids increases to the point at which you would have to spray. After the early dough stage, we don't really need to worry about it anymore. Pay special attention to late planted fields. Joachim had mentioned the stay green. There may be some varieties that are staying greener longer than others. You want to pay special attention to those. Scout your entire field. Know where those aphids are. Know where your actual enemies are and what they are doing. If you do have to spray at one of these later stages, pay attention to the pre-harvest interval. And that is all I have. Thank you very much.